happy day. So we have a silent prayer. Amen. So for the past couple of studies that I've been doing, when we have an opportunity, I've been trying to look on how we construct lines, right? So in our study today, I wish to continue with the same subject. And the last time we had a study, we were attempting to look this, and we were approaching it from the book of Matthew chapter 24. For those of us who can remember, all were present. So I don't wish to spend a lot of time doing a recap, because I know like we also have limited time, but I'll do a quick recap to get us to speed of where we were so that we can move on to where we are headed. So before we go to the book of Matthew chapter 24 and continue to dissect it, so the first thing we did is that we tried to locate the historical context of Matthew chapter 24. And we know that the historical context is important because it prophetically shows us where the period in which the prophet stands when he's writing those particular words. So we went to the book of John chapter 1, all right? So when we went to the book of John chapter 1, what we went to do there is that we were attempting to um, to locate the history of Christ. So if we go to John chapter 1, and we are not going to read the whole book, but if you read from verse 1, it will introduce us to a beginning where we have a word, and the word was with God, and the word was God. So if you read um, the verses after that, you'll see that John is describing the word to be Christ, right? So the word that is spoken in verse 1, if you read from verse 2 to around verse 7, you'll already realize that that word is Christ, right? So if you come to verse 13, 14, it will show you that that word now is made fresh. In other words, now it's going to take you to a scenario where the word that is Christ is made fresh. And that is around the time when Christ is born. All right? So John will continue, and if you jump to verse 29 through verse 32, now is going to take us to a specific point in the life of the word. And verse 29 is now giving us the baptism of the word, that is Christ. In other words, John chapter 1 is going to introduce a word, and then it will define who the word is Christ, and then it will start discussing different events that happened in the life of the word. So now, my interest will be in verse 29 through 32, because now verse 29 through 32 will give us some historical context on where we are standing. Because verse 29 through 32, that is not the baptism of Christ. All right? Now, Gitau. So, this is John chapter 1. So, we are being given a word. So, I'll ignore the history that is given before, and I'll go to verse 29. Although you must read to 32, and at that point, what is introduced to us is the baptism of the word, the baptism of Christ. So now we start being aware on where we are standing historically. So when we speak about the baptism of Christ Gitau, which year is that? When Christ is baptized. So which year are we in history? 27 AD, right? So historically then, now we are aware that we are in 27 AD, all right? So I want us to leave John chapter 1, and then now we move to John chapter 2, right? So if you go to John chapter 2, now we know that is the first miracle of Christ. That is the very first miracle Christ does, and now Christ has started his ministry. If you read from the very first verse in chapter 2, verse 1. But I want us to move to verse 13. I'm just trying to mention this point by passing because of time. So if you go to verse 13, I read, and the Jews' Passover was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem and found in the temple those that sold oxen and sheep and doves and the changers of money sitting. Now, if we go to verse 13, it gives us another important historical context that can help us locate where we are. So, verse 13 is giving us the Passover, Mwangi. So when did the Passover happen in the Jewish economy? Becky, when did the Passover happen? The 14th day of the first month. So we know without doubt, therefore, when we are moving to the book of John chapter 2, so this is John 1. So if we move to chapter 2, verse 13, we know we are at the Passover. And we know in the Jewish economy, in the Passover, we are in the 14th day of the first month. So now the burden here is to look at if we are at the 14th day of the first month of which year. Because we know in the previous verse, chapter 1, verse 29, we were in 27 AD. So now, if you come to chapter 2, verse 13, we are in the 14th day of the first month. So the burden is to find if we are in the 14th day of the first month, that means in the Jewish economy, we are at the beginning of the year. Because now we understand these things when we are studying Ezra 7:9. The Jewish economy used to run from spring to spring. So the first day of the first month will be in the spring, which will be equivalent to around April, if you remember when we come to the Gregorian calendar. So the burden will be, if we are in the 14th day of the first month, that means the year is just starting. Of which year are we in? So I'd like us to go back to verse 29 of the chapter 1 for a minute. All right? So Rizpah, baptism of Christ, I want us to look for a season when it happened. I mean, all right? I mean, we already know we are in 27 AD, but what now I want us to look at is which period in 27 AD are we in? Are we in the beginning, the middle, or the end of 27 AD? So do you have a clue on which time in 27 AD Christ was baptized? No, you can even go to history because the verse has told us we are at the baptism of Christ. So now I'm looking the season. Which time in the year was Christ baptized? Which time? The beginning, the middle, or the end? Which season? Now, we already know that the Jewish year runs from spring to spring. Sindio. So up after spring, we have the summer, we have the autumn, and then we have the winter. And then we go to spring again. So that is how the Jewish year is running. So the Jewish year is basically from spring to spring. All right? So we are in a Jewish year, 27 AD, and we have been brought to a time when Christ is being baptized. So my question basically I'm asking then, which time of the year is this? Is it the summer, autumn, or winter? It's the autumn. We know how we can prove that. I think we know. But I'll give a reference and not necessarily go there. I think if you go to Great Controversy 326, it will break down because it will walk you now from 457 AD, the atom, and then it will give you 69 weeks when Christ is baptized, the fullness of the year concept. So if we are in the atom of 57 AD, we must go to the atom of this year for the 7th week. Remember, it's 1 week from 27 to 34. So 1 week, 7 years will take you from the atom of 27 AD to the atom of 34 AD. So I've not spent a lot of time, but I mean, that can be proven. So then you realize that when we are in John chapter 1, verse 29, we are not just in any time in 27 AD, we are specifically in the atom of 27 AD, right? Does that make sense? So Christ is baptized in the atom of 27 AD. Now, if then you go to the next verse, which is John chapter 2, verse 13, and we are in the spring, that tells you then we've moved from the previous year, we are now in the new year. So without spending a lot of time, I'm going to say, if you come to the Passover, then now we'll be in 28 AD. So we've moved from 27 AD, and now we are in the Passover of the following year. So John chapter 2, verse 13 is taking us 14th day of the first month, which is the spring or the start of the next year. So now we are in 28 AD. All right? Now, so the next verses, verse 14, verse 15, verse 16, and verse 17, basically, they are going to give you what we call the first temple cleansing. So when Christ now is going back to Jerusalem, he's going to, and he finds the changers of money, all those things that are doing in the temple. Now he cleanses the temple the first time. So that is what we call the first temple cleansing. So from that analogy, then you realize that when Christ was starting his ministry, I think there is a quote for that. I don't have it, should it be in, I think 2SM 116, thereabout, where Ellen White says, when Christ started his ministry, he cleansed the temple, and at the end of his ministry, he cleansed the temple. Remember the concept of the two temple cleansing. So you can see that the moment Christ started his ministry, he cleanses the temple the first time, the spring of 28 AD. And then we'll see when he's closing his ministry, he still cleanses the temple. So two temple cleansing at the beginning of his ministry and at the end of his ministry. Right? So there is a specific verse I'm looking. So I want us to go to verse 19. Sorry, I'm just moving a little quicker. So verse 19, I read, Jesus answered and said unto them, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I raise it up. Then said the Jews, 46 years was this temple in building, and will thou raise it up in 3 days? Right? But he spake of the temple of his body. When therefore he was risen from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this unto them, and they believed the scripture and the word which Jesus had said. Now, I know we already know the application of that as brought clearly, but the application we used the last time we were doing this is that we know now when we are studying the Bible, we have hidden treasure and then we have service treasure. So service treasure is what already is given there, that the 3 days represents the 3 days when Christ died and then he resurrects. But I said there is another application that we can get from that. And we know in prophecy, a day equals to a year. Therefore, those 3 days can represent 3 years. All right? And we said one. And we said if we move from the spring of 28 AD, we move 1 year, it will take to 29 AD, but it will still take us to the spring, right? So we have a year. So if you move from the spring of 29 AD, again you move another year, it will take you to the spring of 30 AD, right? So if you move an year, which will be the 3rd year, it will take you to the spring of 31 AD. And when is Christ crucified? Pamela, when is Christ crucified? You have to be audible. Sorry? All right. Nana namsikia. No, just tell us what she's saying. Now, Christ is crucified 31 AD, but we know when Christ is crucified in 31 AD, is crucified and is a symbol of the Passover lamb. So Christ is not crucified at any point in 31 AD, but he is specifically crucified in the 14th day of the first month because he was the Passover lamb, the symbol of Passover. So now, if you move from 27 AD to 28 AD without spending time proving, I'll say these are 6 months. All right? And then we have the first year, the second year, the 3rd year. And how many years did Christ work in person when he was on earth? Morioki? 3.5 years, and then the other 3.5 years he works in the context of his disciples, right? So I'm saying those 3 years, in a spiritual sense, or another application is that it symbolizes the years that Christ worked when he was on earth, from the time that he starts his ministry to the end of his ministry is 3 years. So 3 years was Christ in building this temple, or sorry, in destroying this temple while he's raising another temple. So those 3 years, I'm saying, they represent the 3 years when Christ worked on earth. So those 3 years, and then there is 6 months, which makes 3.5 years, right? So now, with that in mind, now we go back to Matthew chapter 24. So I don't want us to lose that. The reason why we are there is that there is a temple that is being destroyed, and Christ is trying to raise another temple. So we go to Matthew chapter 24. So Matthew chapter 24, verse 1, I read, "And Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came to him for to shew him the buildings of the temple." So Matthew chapter 24, verse 1 will bring us to a point when Christ is going out of the temple. So now we are students of prophecy, parables. Becky, so if Christ is going out of the temple, what else must we look for as students of prophecy? You understand the question? All right. You've come to the church. All right. That is not a correct rephrase. So you've gone out of this church. So if you go out, what does that mean? There is a point you came to the church, right? Otherwise, you can't leave the church if you do not come before. Does that make sense? So Matthew chapter 24, verse 1 is bringing us to a point when Christ is going out of the temple. So what must we look for? The time when he came to the temple, right? So Carl, do you have a clue when Christ came to the temple? The context of this in verse 24 is going out of the temple. So we are looking when he comes to the temple.
guess is we have to check in the previous chapters.
Exactly. You have a clue where?
No, not exactly.
All right. So we go to the previous chapters. So you go to verse, okay, I'll give you clues. So if you go to chapter 23, Christ is preaching in the temple. All right? That is, I think, his last sermon in the temple. If you go to chapter 22, Christ is still preaching in the temple, right? When he's giving that common parable. So the only time then you'll see Christ coming to the temple will be chapter 21, right? Now, before even we read, all we give a specific verse, we know chapter 21 is what in the history of the word, in the history of Christ. What is Matthew chapter 21? A summary. Gladys. The triumphant entry to Jerusalem, right? So, chapter 21 is the triumphant entry of Christ to Jerusalem. All right? Now, if we go back to the book of John, we remember when we went to verse 13, Christ was living. Where was he? Not Bethany. What's the word? I'm forgetting the word, but you can go back. He was somewhere doing his work, and then the Passover is here. So Christ leaves that place, I think it's Capernaum, and then goes back to Jerusalem to observe Passover. So now, why does Christ have to go to Jerusalem to observe Passover? Why can't he do it in either Bethany or Capernaum, wherever he is? Why must he go to Jerusalem? Reuben, you're not sure? Esther? Why must Christ go to Jerusalem to observe Passover? It was a lawyer, but not the exact wording. That is correct, not the exact wording. Morioki, why must Christ go to Jerusalem to observe Passover? All right. Not in the context. Okay, let's move from the context of chapter 21. We go to John chapter 2. Christ, when he realizes it's the Passover, when he's starting his ministry, he still goes to Jerusalem to observe the Passover. So why still go to Jerusalem? The temple is in Jerusalem, right? Do we have the temple in Capernaum or in Ethiopia or wherever Christ is working? The temple is only in Jerusalem. And for them to observe the Passover, they have to observe it from the temple. So Christ has to go to Jerusalem because that is where the temple is. That is where in the start of his ministry, in verse 13, when he realizes the Passover is nigh, now he goes back to Jerusalem to observe the Passover. That is where the temple is. Now, in chapter 21, Christ is still not in Jerusalem. When he's making a triumphant entry to Jerusalem, is because the Passover is nigh, and where is the temple? The temple is only in Jerusalem. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but I'm saying still at the end of his ministry, that is where we see Christ cleansing the temple the second time. Now you can read chapter 21 and you'll see. So at the beginning of Christ's ministry, he cleanses the temple the first time. At the end of his ministry, he cleanses the temple the second time. So we go to verse 12. So verse 12 will say, and Jesus went into the temple of God. Can we see that? So I'm saying the only time, if you follow those verses, you can see Christ enters the temple in chapter 21, and then Christ will be preaching in chapter 22. Christ will be preaching in chapter 23, and in chapter 24, Christ is going to leave the temple. All right? Now, I want us, before we go to verse 2 of the chapter 24, I want us to go to verse 38. Right? Of chapter 23, verse 38. So Christ says, after he has preached to the scribes and Pharisees, he'll say, behold, your house is left unto you desolate. All right? Now, keep your finger there. Let's go to John chapter 2. All right? I think those are important points to mention. So when he cleanses the temple the first time, mhm, now we verse 16, John chapter 2, verse 16. I read, and said unto them, so that is Christ, and said unto them that sold doves, take these things hence, make not my father's house and house of merchandise. So I want you to see the change of language. When he cleanses the temple the first time, how is Christ calling the Jewish temple? My father's house. All right? And in verse 38, after he has done the second temple cleansing, does he call it my father's house? He calls them, your house has been left unto you desolate. So I want to observe that change of language. I think it's for the reason that when he's standing here, he's telling them, destroy this temple and raise up in 3 days, is because in this point, Christ is progressively raising the temple while he's progressively divorcing the Jewish church, while he's building the Christian church. So by the time it comes to 31 AD, Christ has divorced the Jewish church. No, now it's not my father's house, it is your house has been left unto you desolate. Now, this is what is going to prompt chapter 24. Because Christ has told them, your house has left to you desolate. Now, if you go, that word desolate is the same as destroyed. All right? So he's telling them, your house has been left unto you desolate. Your house has been destroyed. Now the disciples are going to wonder, what does Christ mean? Now then in chapter 24, Christ leaves the temple. And you can read the following verses, the chapters after that, until Christ is crucified. Christ never goes back to the Jewish temple. That is the last time he's in the temple, and he leaves never to come back. Right? Now, and Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came unto him to shew him the buildings of the temple. Now, tell me, why are the disciples showing Christ the building of the temple? Is because of what he has said in verse 38. That is why they are curious. Now they are coming and they are showing him the buildings of the temple. Now, notice, when they have shown him the buildings of the temple, Christ is going to reaffirm the same words he had said in verse 38. Now, verse 2, Christ is going to tell the disciples, and Jesus said unto them, see ye not all these things? Verily I say unto you, there shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be done what? Thrown. So in verse 38, Christ tells them the temple has been destroyed. Now the disciples are coming and they are showing Christ the buildings of the temple, and Christ reaffirms that indeed the temple is going to be destroyed. So I'm saying verse 38 and verse 38 and verse 2 are the same. These repeat and enlarge. In other words, verse 2 is repeating and enlarging verse 38 of the previous word, right? So Christ is just confirming what he had said before. Your house has been left to you unto you desolate is the same thing in verse 2. So the relation between Matthew chapter 23, verse 38, and Matthew chapter 24, verse 2 is repeat and enlarge. Christ confirms. Now, question, Sabina. So, why do you think, why are the disciples showing Christ the buildings of the temple? Sorry? Yeah, in verse 1, it says, when Christ had departed, his disciples came to him to show him the buildings of the temple. Why? Why are the disciples showing Christ the buildings of the temple? Yeah, so when they see the architecture of the temple, remember the previous verse, when we were in John, they had told him 40 and 6 years was this temple in building, but you are saying you can destroy it and raise it up in 3 days. So I'm saying when Christ has told them, behold, your house has been left unto you desolate, the disciples do not believe Christ. So now when he has departed the temple, they'll call him and show him the architects of the temple, and they are telling, I mean, what are you saying? See the architects of the temple. Do you really mean that this temple will be destroyed? And after they have shown him the architects of the temple, Christ in verse 2 will still confirm and tell them, yeah, the temple is going to be destroyed. Does that make sense? Thank you. So now we go to verse 3. I think that is where we were. The last time now, that is what you are handling. Now, because of what Christ has told them in verse 38 and in verse 2, when you come to verse 3, now the disciples, like the relation between those verses is cause and effect. Because Christ has confirmed indeed the temple is going to be destroyed, now in verse 3, they are going to ask Christ specific questions. Now, if you go to verse 3, I read, it says, and as he sat upon the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, tell us, when shall these things be, and what shall be the sign of the coming and the end of the world? So now, because Christ has told them the temple is going to be destroyed, now it invokes the questions in verse 3. Now the disciples are telling him, tell us when are these things are going to be, and when is the Son of Man going to come? All right. Now, to be fair to Christ, so just another small question, we might have discussed it before. So if you read verse 3, they are going to ask twofold questions. One question is going to be in relation to them, when are these things going to be? And then they tell them, then when is the Son of Man going to come? So now, if you look before, if you go to the previous chapters, Christ has only discussed about the destruction of the temple, right? He has not discussed his second coming or the end of the world. So why do we think all the disciples sneaking in a question about the second coming of the Son of Man? Because Christ has been discussing what? The destruction of the temple, right? So why are they sneaking in another question on the second coming? Jeff, you get the question? All right. Verse 3. Matthew, we are in Matthew chapter 24. So the question is, when are these things going to be? When is the temple going to be destroyed? And when is the Son of Man, the second coming? So we are saying, if you look before, or from what we've discussed, Christ had only discussed about the destruction of the temple, right? So why are the disciples sneaking in a question on the second coming? Instead of asking him, when is the temple going to be destroyed? But now they ask him, when is the temple going to be destroyed? And then they also sneak an extra question on, when is the second coming? So why are they sneaking in a question about the second advent?
So I think that basically it's a repeat and enlarge. So I'm assuming that they think that the destruction of the temple is the end of the world.
Exactly. That is correct. It's because, now, let me give context to this. Now, these are the disciples asking Gladys, right? So before Christ came and started being the teacher for the disciples, where were they learning from? The disciples, who are their teachers? The Pharisees, they are learning from the Jewish church, all right? And the Jewish church, these are a group of people who adores the temple. And If you look at Jerusalem, or if you go to history, Jerusalem is not like Nairobi. It's a fenced city, right? See, Jerusalem was a fenced city. So the Jewish already thought the disciples that at any point when Jerusalem will be destroyed, what is that event? The second coming. So they know, therefore, for you to destroy the temple, what must you first bring down? The walls of Jerusalem, right? So therefore, Jerusalem has been destroyed, the temple has been destroyed. Therefore, what do they expect? The second coming is because in the mind of the Jews, when Jerusalem is destroyed, the second coming comes. So they knew if Christ has already told them that this temple is going to be destroyed, then they know at that point when the temple is destroyed, what comes? The second coming. That is where when Christ speaks or confirms to the disciples that this temple is going to be destroyed, in the mind of the disciples, they know then the second advent must also come. That is why in verse 3, they are asking him a question about the destruction of the temple and also what? The second advent. In other words, the destruction of the temple was a sign that the second coming is coming. Does that make sense? Right? Aya. So now we go to verse 3. That is what we were trying to understand the last time. Okay? So we were looking at the number of questions that we see in verse 3. Isabella, how many questions? Matthew chapter 24, verse 3. 3 questions. Tell us the questions. So this Matthew chapter 24, verse 3. So how many questions? 3. Tell us the questions. The first question is, when shall these things be? Right? First question. Second question, I'll call that A. So the first question is, when shall these things be? Second question, okay, what shall be the sign? Shall be the sign of the coming. Sindio? So when shall these things be? What shall be the sign of the coming? That's the question. Isabella? So two or three questions. Huh? Daisy, there are three. Okay. There are two. So what are the two questions? When shall these things be, and what shall be the sign of the coming? Okay. That is Isabella. So now, Daisy, how many questions? 3 questions. What are the questions? What shall these things be? Uh-huh. So that question will be, what shall be the sign of the end of the world? So three questions according to Daisy, 2 questions according to Isabella. Ruben, how many questions? So 2 questions. Yes. Three questions. All right. So when shall these things be? What shall be the sign of the coming, and what shall be the sign of the end of the world? Three questions. Okay.
Well, I think because previously
Yeah.
we had seen that they are marrying the destruction of the temple
With the end of the
with
world.
these last two,
Yes.
then I think they're actually marrying all these three
Okay.
together to happen at the same time.
So how many
So
questions?
in their minds,
Uh-huh.
all these are at the same time.
Yes.
So how many questions to me is not so important.
Yeah.
But just to say that for them, the sign of the coming is the sign of
The end of the world.
yeah.
That is when the temple is destroyed.
Yes.
So now, I agree with you. So how many questions are they asking Christ?
I don't know about that technicality. Really. I don't know if it's that. If it's important, is it important?
It is.
Uh,
To this study, it is.
and of the end of the world. Well, to me, just because of the wording,
Yeah.
because they have not explicitly separated them
Yeah.
in the same way they separated the first.
All right. Yeah. Let's just
Then
move there and just do English.
Sure, sure.
So from English, how many questions?
From English, what shall be the sign of the coming and of the end of the world? Well, I would say
Yeah.
from English,
Yeah.
that sign has two functions.
Uh-huh.
It's the sign of your coming
And the sign of the end of the world. So that sign is twofold.
Yes, it's twofold, but
Twofold.
it's one sign.
Yeah. So that sign, when it comes, it signifies the Son of Man is coming, and then the same sign signifies the end of the world is coming. All right. So we'll come back later when we move on how we read that sign. I think what he's raising is important, but you've just jumped the gun. So mark that. We'll come back on the sign, why we need a sign in B and why we need a sign in C. So you remind me, we'll come back to that, right? So now, your hands up. You Max, verse 3. How many questions? No, we will know how to read. We just want to know how many questions you are seeing. Two questions. What are the questions? Uh-huh. So how will it read in English? When shall these things be as the first question? Then the second question will be, what shall be the sign of the coming and at the end of the world? We convert that and we make it the second question. So two questions, three questions, two. Okay. Before you think, Rispa. Okay. Two or three questions. Two. Okay. You tell us. These things must be verse 2. Verse 2 is the cause, right? He has told them the temple is going to be destroyed. And because of that, that is where the disciples are asking verse 3.
So based on what Jeff was saying, they are able to combine that if the temple will be destroyed, then this will definitely be the end of the world. So when they ask him the question, tell us when shall these things be? And as you are saying clearly that these things are connected with verse 2. So these things must be the destruction of the temple.
Yes.
So as they ask these things be, and
When is the
said,
temple going to be destroyed, basically?
yeah, that's 70.
Yes, yes.
So and then connected to this thing, we are going to ask a second question. It says, what shall be the sign of the coming and of the end of the world?
Yes.
So, just first commenting about the end of the world, if they think the temple will be destroyed and that will mark the end of the world,
Yeah.
so they definitely also think the end of the world will also be the coming of the sign of the coming. So it seems as if there are three questions because they are not asking the coming, they are asking the sign. So to me, I see that there is the sign that will tell us Christ is going to come. So the coming of Christ will be definitely the end of the world and the destruction of the temple. But they first need to know the sign. So it's as if they want a hint that will tell them this is the end of the world, this is when the temple will be destroyed.
Right. So you've seen the destruction of the temple is 70 AD.
Yeah.
All right?
Yeah.
So where are we standing in Matthew chapter 24?
We are around 31.
We are 31. That is why we did this. Remember, this was locating the historical context.
Yes.
So we are in 31 AD.
Yes.
Right? So the destruction of the temple is 70 AD.
Yes.
All right? So now, just remain with me. So verse 2 is verse 38. It's repeat and enlarge. Right? So in verse 38, when he's telling them your temple has been destroyed, what does Christ mean? That the temple has been destroyed in 31 AD, and we know for sure in history the temple is destroyed in 70 AD. So what does Christ mean then? Verse 38.
So when he tells them, there shall not a stone stand upon another.
No, sure. Verse 38 first.
Your house is left and your desolate.
Your house has been destroyed.
It's no longer God's house anymore. Christ has symbolically destroyed the temple. His presence is withdrawn.
Okay. So is the temple destroyed in 31 or 70?
So the physical destruction is 70.
And here is the spiritual destruction. How be it that which is first? And then? Yes, you can go. But you are not speaking to him.
Just agree with him.
Okay, so let me finish with him. We are coming. Just hold on.
So I think when Christ tells them your house is left and your desolate, I think to me there is a cause and effect.
Good. So that is a cause.
Yes.
The effect is 70 AD.
Exactly.
All right. That makes sense to me.
So the presence of God being, he gave us the first temple cleansing. And Christ says, my house, my father's house.
Yes.
So there is an association of Christ with the temple when he does the first temple cleansing. So, but when you come to the second temple cleansing, what we have seen is that Christ is disassociating now. Because I think you pointed us to Matthew 21, where Christ does not say my father's house anymore. He says this house has become a den of thieves.
Yes.
So, and the last words of Christ to that temple.
So in Matthew, he'll tell them your house, but if you go to the start of his ministry, he's calling my house because he's divorced them.
Exactly.
Okay.
So that's why I don't know what I call it spiritual.
No, that is okay. No, I perfectly get what you are saying. Yeah, that makes sense to me. That is what you wanted to say. All right. So in other words, so can we say then, if we go to other parts of prophecy, that 1 AD is a sign of what is coming on 70 AD. Or we also call it an harbinger, right? This, in the language, Ellen White will say an earnest. What happens in the time of Zedekiah is an earnest of what is going to happen in the time of Joachim. No, what happens in the time of Manasseh is an earnest in what is going to happen in the time of Joachim, and Zedekiah. So this is an earnest. So another word for this will be a down payment, right? So therefore, what Christ basically saying is that 1 AD is a sign, an harbinger, an earnest, a down payment of what we expect in 70 AD, right?
I agree.
Okay.
The problem is the disciples understand that because that is correct. I think it makes sense.
Yes.
Christ, that one is the earnest of this.
Yes.
But now I'm just wondering when they ask, what shall be the sign of thy coming? So the main focus of the disciples is the sign
Yes.
of thy coming. And then they connect it to another part and of the end of the world. And then this is what is really, I'm not getting it. I'm trying to see as if there are three distinct questions. These things, the sign of
Which is the destruction of the temple.
yes,
These things, the destruction of the temple, the sign of the coming, the second advent.
yes,
Uh-huh.
and then the end of the world, which is if you combine the coming, which is the end of the world,
Yes.
that coming will definitely mark the end of the world in their mindset.
Yes.
So I tend to think they're asking three questions.
So 3 questions.
Yes.
All right. So time is not on our side. Now, I'm going to make a point and then we'll come back to Matthew chapter 24, verse 3 to see how to read those questions. Now, when we speak about repeat and enlarge, all right? For example, we repeat and enlarge can happen in the same verse. Like one sentence, the next sentence that comes in that verse is repeating and enlarging the previous sentence. That is one way we can see repeat and enlarge. Or repeat and enlarge can come between two verses following each other. Like verse 1 and verse 2 repeats and enlarges verse 1. Or it can come with verses that skips, like we have seen. Verse 2 repeats and enlarges verse 38, and we have verses in between. Or another way, we can have repeat and enlarge where we have chapters following each other. An example, Daniel chapter 7, Daniel chapter 8. 2 chapters following each other and they are repeated and enlarged. Or better still, we can have 2 chapters far apart. Daniel chapter 2, Daniel chapter 7, far apart, repeat and enlarge. We can even have a scenario where we have a repeat and enlarge in different, how do we call, like Daniel, we call it the book. So different writers, but it's a repeat and enlarge. So I want us to, for a minute, to walk out of Matthew chapter 24 and go to other prophecies that repeat and enlarge this, to see how they are presented. So we try and compare and contrast them. We see if they give us extra information in the context of verse 3. Does that make sense, Daisy? So now we know the book of.
Can you prove that we have two or three questions in chapter 24 without using any other?
2 or 3. I think what I get is verse 3 is either 2 or 3 questions, depending on how you read them. But what I'm saying, the reason why I'm saying we compare and contrast, because there is a prophetic art that enables us to get more information on what we cannot get from one verse. We can go, the reason why, the whole purpose of repeat and enlarge is it gives us extra information. So we have an opportunity, we have extra information elsewhere. Why can't we go to that extra information? Okay, yeah, we can. We can prove. No, I want to go to the other. So we'll come back. So I think I have maybe less than 10 minutes. So, sorry? 17, okay, that is fair. So we'll be able to do it. So we know Matthew chapter 24 is also given in other gospels, right? So where else can we find Matthew chapter 24, Daisy? Where else in the gospels can we find this prophecy? In the gospels. Becky? Where else is Matthew chapter 24? Yes, yes. Luke chapter? Luke chapter 21. Okay? So Matthew chapter 24 is the same line that is taken in Luke chapter 21. So where else? Mark 13. Okay. So I want us to go to Mark 13, and another one will be, okay, let me give some space. So we'll go to Mark 13, then we'll go to Luke 21. All right? So let's start. Mark na Luke, gani ndio kucha ya kwanza? Mark. So we start with Mark. Mark 13. So you can see, and he went out of the temple, is the same. Went out of the temple, one of his disciples said unto him, Master, see what manner. So you can read all those. But I want specifically the verse that speaks to verse 3. Verse 3 and 4. Sindio, Mark makes them 4. So in the context of Mark, this will be Mark 3 and 4. So Mark 3 and 4 is Matthew chapter 3. Right? Right? So I read, says, and as he sat upon the Mount of Olives over against the temple, Peter and James, John and Andrew asked him privately. So the disciples, if you go to Matthew chapter 24 verse 3, it'll say the disciples asked him privately. But Mark is just going to give us specifically who are these disciples. And we know those disciples will be Peter, James, John, and Andrew. Do you see that? So it's not all the 12 disciples. It's 4 of the 12 disciples asking Christ privately. They'll ask him, now verse 3, so verse 4, tell us, when shall these things be, and what shall be the sign when all these things shall be fulfilled? Mwangi, how many questions? What are the questions? So this Mark is, when shall these things be? That is the first question, right? Uh-huh. What shall be the signs when all these things shall be fulfilled? Sorry. All these things shall be fulfilled. So 2 questions, Mwangi, right? Ochola, how many questions in Mark? 2 questions, right? Daisy, how many questions in Mark? 2 questions. All right. Now, Becky, we said Christ has been teaching the disciples about the destruction of the temple. But in Matthew, they sneak in a question about the end of the world, right? So in Mark, those 2 questions, are they in relation to the temple or in relation to the end of the world? Both means in relation to. Okay, we go to verse 4. Tell us, when shall these things be? What are these things? And what shall be the sign when all these things shall be fulfilled? So which question is speaking to the destruction of the temple among the 2 questions? Like in Matthew, this question is speaking to the destruction of the temple. All these questions are speaking to the end of the world. So which is the question that is speaking to the destruction of the temple? Which is the question that is speaking to the end of the world? Eh, Sabina. How many questions first? 2 questions. What are they speaking to? So they are speaking to the destruction of the temple. We don't have questions speaking to the end of the world in Mark. Okay. You agree, Gladys? You agree with her? All right. Ruben. Yeah. Yes. Yes. But even in Matthew, it was still saying these things. Yeah. So we cannot see it there. So how many questions? 2 or 3? Right. So 2 questions. Okay. Yes. Uh-huh. Mhm. Right. That's fair. Okay. How many questions? Joy. Yes. Yes. Yeah. Yes, I agree. All right. So your hand was up, Wangi. No, Joy is saying, story na, these things is Christ who came with it first. Is the one who uses that word first. So and then now they'll ask him, then when shall these things be, and what sign shall be there when all these things shall be fulfilled? Yes. Yeah. The world. Yeah. Mhm. Two questions. So which question speaks to the destruction of the temple? Which question speaks to the end of the world? All right. Okay. Uh-huh. Of the temple. Yes, I agree. No, I think they're all the same. I think they're all the same. Anyway. Uh-huh. But are they correct? What the disciples have their mind, is it correct that when the temple will be destroyed, the end of the world will come? Is that a correct analogy? The analogy the disciples have. It's a wrong analogy. Okay. Okay, we'll see. So, if we don't mind, we can go to Luke 21. Cindy, we can go to Luke 21. Luke 21. So I just want the verse that speaks to verse 3 of Matthew chapter 24. Ni verse? Verse 7. Thank you. So Luke 21, the verse of interest will be verse 7. Okay. So verse 7, I read, and they asked him, saying, Master, but when shall these things be? And what sign will be there? Sorry, and what sign will there be when these things shall come to pass? So again, how many questions in Luke, Pachola? In Luke, we are looking at verse 7. How many questions? Two questions. Tell us the questions. Uh-huh. When shall these things be? Right? What is the second question? Uh-huh. What sign will? Uh-huh. So two questions. When shall these things be? And what sign will be there when these things shall come to pass? All right. How many questions? Two questions. What are the questions? Same? All right. Judy, Luke 21, verse 7. How many questions? Two questions. Same. All right. Carl, yes.
I agree. Two questions.
Two questions. Okay.
And I think
Uh-huh.
even with that sign,
Yeah.
it's actually previously we had said the sign was referring to just the coming and of the end of the world.
Yes.
But I think we can see it's not just those two. It's also a sign of the destruction of the temple because it's all happening at the same time.
So the one sign signifies three things: the destruction of the temple, the coming of the Son of Man, and the end of the world. Okay. So two questions. But at least all of us can agree that when we are in Mark and we are in Luke, we have two questions. So now what we need to agree is when we are in Matthew, we are either speaking to two questions or three questions, right? Okay. My time is over. I think I still have the next class. So we'll carry on from there. Okay, we pray. Dear Lord, we thank you for the blessing of the Sabbath, and we thank you for the blessing of the fellowship. We know that it's a blessing to always come together as people united by the truth to try and dissect your word. Our prayer is that you may give us understanding and you may help us to settle to the truth, both spiritually and intellectually, that we cannot be moved. We pray for all the programs of the day that you might be with us and send your Holy Spirit to abide with us throughout the Sabbath. For I pray and believe in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.